Hello, everybody, and welcome to Incorruptible Mass, where we're really here to help you understand state politics. So we talk a lot about why things are so broken, what we can have here in Massachusetts if we fix it, and how you can get involved. And today we are talking about the elections that just happened, but specifically about the ballot questions. So we had some good successes. We won a lot of ballot questions. We're going to talk a little bit about like what happened around the state in different places. We're going to talk about turnout in different communities. We're going to talk also a little bit about the ballot questions that were non-binding and how they did. And before we do that, let me introduce my inimitable co-hosts, beginning with Jordan Berg-Powers.
My name is Jordan Berg-Powers. I use he, him, and I have several years working in progressive politics in Massachusetts.
And Jonathan Cohn.
Jonathan Cohn, his activist based out of Boston. I've done work on electoral and issue-based campaigns in Massachusetts. I was particularly active in question 1, but also question 4, and look forward to chatting about both. And then I'll pass it over to you.
Anna Callahan, she, her, coming at you from Medford. So let's go ahead super quick, just introduce the ballot measures. So question 1 was on the fair share amendment, whether we could, because here in Massachusetts, you can't have a progressive income tax, but allowing us to tax people who earn over $1 million and only those people 4% on just the income above $1 million. Question 2 was about dental charges and what percentage of dental charges could actually be spent on non-dentists, non-care. And then question 3 was about liquor licenses and trying to expand liquor licenses and tweak them a little bit. Question 4 was about basically enabling everybody who is over the age of 16 with or without official U.S. documentation to take a test to get a driver's license and to be insured for a driver's license. And then we had a couple of ballot questions which were non-binding, so they did not become laws. They just advise their state reps. One of them was for passing Medicare for all here in Massachusetts, and the other one is around transparency and knowing how our state reps vote in committees. Woo! How'd I do? Did I get them all?
Good. Yeah.
Well, yes.
I want to talk really quickly about the history of question 1 and the taxation and things. So way back when, some 13 years ago, there were already meetings happening around trying to raise the income tax. So for those of you who don't know, we have a flat tax. It is very shocking and very regressive. It means that the more money you have, the less of the state burden that you are paying. And that's if you add in fees, sales tax, all the other things that we pay, poor people and middle class people in Massachusetts are the carriers of the burden of the state, and rich people largely get off. They have a bunch of tax breaks. And there aren't really sufficient tax breaks for regular folks. So there was an attempt to raise the income tax back to 5.95 and to create some exemptions that are targeted towards regular people so that it could be easier for people to get by. And that campaign was called the Act to Reinvest. And Deval Patrick was the governor at the time. He supported it. We had a broad coalition of groups working on it. It was wildly popular among people. They would have mostly seen a tax break, or at least at the very least stayed the same, and it would have tilted it back towards regular people. And the legislature, with DeLeo and Senate President Terry Murray, took that bill, gutted it, raised the sales tax and the gas tax, and then
aggressive.
And it did nothing to raise the income tax on rich people. So in fact, they took our progressive legislation and made it worse. Those were obviously wildly unpopular with regular voters. And we decided to start something to try to, go to the ballot because of the inability of the state legislature to focus its energy on actual taxation. Out of that, Jake Hoffman got his committee on taxation, and through that, a ballot initiative was formed that sort of got thrown out. Very, I would say, not based on actual law by Governor Baker appointees to the judicial Supreme Court. Luckily for us, those same people then started throwing out bills that we don't like. So ballot initiatives we don't like on that same terrible precedent. So there you go for precedent, at least working for our behalf. But I think it's important to go back to that because it starts with the inability of our legislature to act on behalf of regular people. And this is the culmination of work to rebalance a little bit, not even as much as it should. The other piece is that every legislator, every year, whether local or state, promises more money for schools. They all do, and they don't do it. This is the thing when people feel like politicians are lying. Like, this is the place that gets me the most frustrated because it's the easiest thing to want to do, and they never really do it. We really nickel and dime our schools. I joke all the time because one of the dumb things people would say is, we shouldn't throw money at schools. I was like, if you have $20, roll down your window and throw it at a school. Like, they will literally use it for kids. Like, they are, kids are hungry. Kids don't have the books they need. I know for my school, our library, and many of the books at the school are all donated by parents and drives. Our schools, especially in urban poor and urban centers, do not have resources and desperately need money. And our state has not made the investment it should have made, and it promised to make to our students. And so this really does tilt it back towards those things. And so the ballot initiative on question 1, it sort of did two things. It did the thing the legislature should do and doesn't do. It rebalanced the state to say that people who can afford it should pay their fair share. And it started a reinvestment in our schools, which the legislature had failed to do year after year after year after year, both locally and in the state.
Yeah, just to tag in there with follow-up two things, especially with the backstory is that's like the most recent incarnation of the push to address this. I thought that although the Globe's editorial supporting question 1 was whining, still supported it, but I thought it was a really interesting setup in the beginning when it noted about how I forget, it was in the 1910s, there was one year where they note about how the men of Massachusetts, the male voters of Massachusetts went to the polls to vote on two things. They, I think, had made two mistakes. One, their vote no on women's suffrage. And then the fact that they also voted to create a flat tax in Massachusetts that we then have 100 years later have still had, and that there had been efforts over the years. One of them that's always just kind of funny for me is that Jim Braude was the one. Jim Braude was the one heading up the one effort in the early 90s. I forget what the organization was that he was with at the time, but that you had numerous efforts over the years to change this, and they all failed, and a number of times often failed miserably. And so it was kind of an inspiring thing, especially I'd say like from being a part of the Raise Up coalition, is knowing that we had people in that coalition who are part of those past fights. What's especially exciting to win that, because like if you are somebody who because then you have actors who've been around since like the 70s, you've been in part of you've been in this battle before of trying to make that happen and have seen it lose under a kind of a large avalanche of outside money and kind of a good media game. And so it was exciting that we were able to win and look at a different environment, I'd say, as well, with kind of this go around. And it was interesting to say what made this time different than past efforts. And I would say kind of a few different things on that front. One is a more evenly matched spending. I think definitely helped in knowing that in past campaigns, the opposition heavily outspent. And I think with this go around, it was particularly the kind of the teachers, but and other unions as well, like the SEIUs, knew that they wanted to put up a lot on this, because knowing that if we don't succeed on this, it's gonna we're not seeing progress on that in the legislature. And so wanting to do that, as well as knowing that if we don't succeed here, it also puts a damper on the ability to do anything similar in other states. If you succeed, you can provide lessons to other states and inspire other states to take examples and make it so that those who would be providing funding, whether are unions or some of the kind of liberal philanthropy world willing to invest in such efforts in other states if it passes. And if it doesn't, here in like liberal Massachusetts, makes that effort much harder and those funds dry up elsewhere.
And speaking of other states, like 34 other states have progressive income tax. So when people talk about, oh, we're one of the most progressive states, like we are not in this particular arena.
No,
like we're one of definitely in the bottom half, in the bottom 2/3 for sure, of states in terms of progressive income tax, which is not great.
Which I think it gets to something that I've been, I often say, and I think we don't do enough, is that we need to not be scared of our belief systems, but we can't fight battles around these big ideas with things on the ballot. We actually need to fight these battles all the time. And so I wish, we would take the lesson from this and not sort of sit around and wait for another ballot initiative to talk about taxation. We need to talk about what taxes do right now, like not like tomorrow. And, we need, you for $1,000, you could be running ads in Facebook around the country explaining that like your tax dollars go to schools. It goes to things. It pays for things. Like, there is, I'm going to take a little swipe at the governor-elect Bar Healy, but I just like the one thing I hate is that Democrats and Republicans both say the same thing. I'm going to invest in something and I'm going to cut taxes, right? Bar Healy was like, whole ad is like, I'm going to invest in these things and I'm going to cut your taxes. That's not how math works. No. Sorry, that's just not like you can't cut taxes and say you're going to spend more because invest means spend. That's not how money works.
Yeah.
If you
not at the state level for sure, different question at the national level, but like
the national level, but
state level, if you're spending money, you got to bring in money.
Even at the national level, at some point you have to backfill your spending with some sort of tax revenue. So you need to bring in money, and you can't just simply do this thing where we're just like taxes are bad, but government, but things it does are good. Like, no, you pay for what you get. That's why these rich towns have nice things.
Yeah.
It also reminds me of the idea that like taxation is punishment is also the thing that makes it easier for kind of the opposition to kind of weaken support. And like, for instance, like the one thing that I think definitely was one of the most damaging opposite points in the opposition that definitely swayed, I think, particularly like soi-disant liberal, like upper income folks, is the idea of the one-time millionaire, that whether it's you're selling your house or you're selling your business, and just that year you enter that higher bracket, and like that's not fair to you to have to put like a few extra $1,000 on your like more than $1 million like windfall, when it's like, rather than like the fact that people view it from that perspective rather than taking a step back. If anything that you had appreciated that much in value, it's because of a lot of the investments that were made. Like, it's like all of these people who probably love Elizabeth Warren and remember her the big speech from her in her Senate campaign, her first Senate campaign of the like of talking about like kind of like the you didn't build that, of like, no, if you had a successful business, it's because of the roads that people built, it's the schools that people invested in. That's what causes a lot of the appreciation and value far beyond what you invested in it itself, because your investments in that or the work that you do to take care of your house aren't what caused it to appreciate that much in value, and you're paying it forward to the society that gave you that blessing by contributing for everybody else. And so I think that it speaks to, it's not like that need for that shift in values. And it's like where to make that argument, to be able to make that kind of argument against it harder for people. Because when I see that and see like the difficulty it is for people getting past that, like that's going to make it difficult to raise money for housing. If we need like something like a transfer fee as a possible source of raising money from housing, yes, there are some people you should feel so lucky if you're housing, that your house is appreciated so much in value that we could actually get real money out of it from like a very marginal additional fee. But like you'll get that pushback if that same mentality stays and make it harder to address other issues that we have in the state.
Yeah. So I know, Jonathan, you were talking a little bit about like what we learned from different parts of the state and looking at where these two Well, we're talking
Yeah.
about 1 and 4 actually. And maybe before we, sorry, I just realized, should we talk a little bit about 4 generally before we dive into, because I think it's interesting to see these numbers and compare 1 and 4. So maybe if we have anything to say about question 4.
Question 4 again is another, after 18 years, maybe
Mhm.
20 years, depending on who you ask, there was an attempt to allow drivers to get licensed regardless of their legal federal status. It's a really simple measure that again has passed a lot of states, including red states. And it just simply says, if you're going to drive on the roads, we want to know who you are. It also is a really important, I think, for the progressives listening, it's a value statement, right? Like we want people to be able to succeed, to be a part of our society. And it allowed immigrants who don't have the proper documentation to be a part of our society, to drive their kids to school safely, to not worry about being on the roads. And it's the number one thing that ICE uses to sort of as a gateway to getting deportations is driving illegally. So I think, it's a really important measure just around humanity and seeing our immigrant neighbors as people who are worthy of being a part of this community and worthy to get around, worthy to be a part of their families, worthy to take their kids to school, and all the things that we take for granted. And so it's really big deal that it passed the legislature. The Republicans then thought that would be a way to galvanize support for deals. So they put it on the ballot to repeal it immediately, so much so that it didn't even get into the ballots that were printed by the state. I mean, the questionnaires printed by the state. And so it got on there to sort of repeal.
One thing I would just use that kind of dimension of Jeff Jill as a piggyback for before then talking about the like wider state landscape. One thing that I think is an important takeaway from this election, and it is in many ways that so takeaway from this election is you have a number of Democratic state legislators in Massachusetts who tend to be very skittish on issues of taxes or on issues of immigrants' rights because they think, oh, well, like my constituents are all opposed to this and I could be defeated by a Republican, even though they like never get challengers in the first place. And I think that the thing that's an important takeaway is that like, yes, like I would have loved if questions 1 and 4 passed every municipality in Massachusetts by glowing numbers. That reality is kind of given, like the politics of places was otherwise. But we had a tax question on the ballot, and then we had a question about immigrants on the ballot, and not a single Democratic state legislator lost their seat because of that. And that's the thing. It's like, no matter how it did in their district, they did not lose because of it. And which is an important thing for them to remember, that it's not like the Republicans thought that having question 4 on the ballot would juice turnout for them, and the seats that flipped in the House were 2 open seats that flipped Democratic. Possibly, like, I don't know what will happen in that one thing that I think is going to recount, but I think that the Republicans are leading the one that's like Groton and their area around there that Sheila Harrington used to have. But there was no Republican wave that accompanied that. There was no Republican wave that accompanied the discussion of taxes. And so I think that's important for people who like, and I would even bet that in many of the municipalities, even where questions 1 and 4 have actually lost, I would be shocked if the numbers were not higher than legislators would have told you that their own districts would give to those questions.
As usual, like legislators believe that their districts are more conservative than they actually are. They prove to be under voting.
Exactly. So like, which is I think an important thing kind of to realize with that. But like as I had alluded to before, the ultimate map is fascinating because if you look at the map.
Before you do that, I just want to jump in with one other sort of general thing, which is, to me, one thing that I think we have to be really aware of and continually be reminded of and learn as progressives is that nothing is certain. It ain't over until it's over. And, this was one where 20 years of advocacy and of, hard work and hundreds of thousands of volunteer hours, and that bill finally got through the legislature, right? And a change of speaker and everything finally got through the legislature. And then the other side put it on the ballot, right? So we can't relax. And I see this a lot in electoral campaigns. A lot of our candidates with Incorruptible Mass had things to say about they had unexpected, flyers that came out the 3 days before the election that said things that weren't really true, like that they were so surprised. You know, we cannot be surprised anymore. We have to be aware that the other side is going to fight tooth and nail, and it doesn't matter how right we are. It doesn't matter if the people are on our side. It doesn't matter, like, if the legislators have voted for it. Like, we have to expect that they will continue until the last possible card has been played. And if we expect it, then we can have a much easier time of like being prepared. I know that people in that coalition, you know, after they had won this 20-year battle, they were like, oh, thank goodness it's over. And then when this new ballot measure came up, it was a shock. It was a surprise, and an unpleasant surprise. And there was a lot of, you know, trying to, you know, scrambling to try and make sure that it didn't get thrown out after it just been passed, you know, oh my God. So we should, you know, all remember that wins are not wins until all the cards have been played.
No, I think I'd say two things I'd love about those. One, the importance of making sure that your coalition that can get something, can win something, can protect it. And I think that that's the kind of a really important thing about that, with really that both of these are examples of in many ways. And also I would say the fact that it's important, even if you think that something is leading, to make sure that that the win requires actual work. Because one thing that I know with question one that like we often heard from some of the consultants on the campaign internally is that there's a history with the polling on revenue campaigns showing stronger results than what actually happens on election day. Because you probably do have a certain type of voter, I would think, particularly, let's say, a generally liberal upper income homeowner who knows that they should vote yes, but doesn't want to, but they know that they should. And so they probably will tell a pollster that they're voting yes, because they know that that's what they should do, but they might not in reality. And which speaks to kind of the importance of actually having that kind of strong having a strong operation throughout, and making sure that you are doing the work to turn out voters and to convince voters. Because you could, like, just because people tell a poll that they're going to do something doesn't always mean that they will.
Well, let's go ahead and look at how things actually turned out in the different towns across cities and towns across Massachusetts.
Yeah, so on that, and then like you feel free to kind of tag in it kind of as you want. What was fascinating to me was looking at the results in questions 1 and 4, and it was something that I had seen in some of the crosstabs of polling before as well, that they ended up in a similar space. Question 4 ended up with a little higher of a lead than question 1, both of them under Healy, but with very different compositions. And I know that internal polling that had been done from question 1 showed that there was a shared base of about 75% of the voters. That question 1 voters were also question 4 voters, but that their like majority making was different. And which was really interesting to see that play out in what you actually see in the state, because you'll have kind of your progressive pockets where you see strong numbers for both, like your Amherst, which was over 80% for both. Your Northampton, your Cambridge and Somerville, although Cambridge and Somerville posted more for 4 than 1 because some of the people in the really large, increasingly expensive houses there might not have been so keen on that, but still like overwhelmingly for 1, with like I think 77% in Cambridge, 79% in Somerville, something like that. And you see a lot like Jamaica Plain would also be kind of posting large numbers like that. Showing numbers, you'll see that the areas of like the affluent liberal areas that still voted yes on 1, but much less than the ticket and less than they did for 4. A place like Newton, a place like Lexington, a place like Concord, a place like Lincoln, where they do have enough of like a liberal local culture, if not a lefty local culture, but a liberal local culture where they will still vote, enough people will still vote yes, but not putting up a huge margin. Compared to what the margin they would give a Democratic candidate. And then you'll have the towns that are affluent towns without a liberal political culture that voted no heavily on question 1, even if they might vote for question 4 and were strong for the Democratic ticket. Like a Wellesley, like a Weston, like a Dover, like a Winchester, a Hingham, a Cohasset, places where the main reason why you know them is how much money they have. Like if you talk about like Newton, Lexington, kind of like Concord, your image of them isn't just that they're rich areas. You do kind of tend to see like activists coming out of them. That's not the reputation that Dover has. Dover has is that reputation is that it's very rich. And that's how it like they've been over the with like the general trend kind of demographic trends in partisan voting, they've become more democratic, but they're still very rich and that they voted like it. And at the same time, you'll have places that are more working class in the state where question 1 tended to do better than question 4, either in some places in Western Mass, where even though they did both win, the 1 vote was strong, the 4 vote was weak. Places like Fall River and New Bedford that voted for 1 but not for 4. I think there are some other places in Western Mass that was the same case as well, or some of the towns in the South Coast that were both lost, but the loss for 4 was much greater than the loss for 1. And it's fascinating when you see all those different types of places in Massachusetts and how you get a sense of like the political typography of the state.
Yeah.
Just because it's easy, like whenever you talk about like a statewide things, people talk about like liberal Massachusetts, and like, yes, like the way I kind of describe Massachusetts is I think that we have about a third of the state that is reliably like liberal, progressive, etc. We have a third of the state that's pretty strongly conservative, and then a population in between. And that you can win over that population in between. But it'll be typically in different percentages of that. And then you have that population that you typically, like about a third of the state that you typically just don't win.
Right. Yeah.
But any other any kind of observations that you've had when it comes to like what that kind of landscape looked like?
Well, Jordan, you did have some turnout observations about, different communities and their turnout in terms of voting in Massachusetts.
Yeah, so a lot of the way that you could think about this is just the simple number of like how did it do and how did it not do. But the other piece you could think about it is who's missing and would their voices have been different about a lot of these questions. And so one of the things that I think people, when we think about Massachusetts, we think about all the things we do right, which are lots of things. But one of the things we do very poorly is our newly reelected Secretary of the Commonwealth is bad at his job. And we don't actually, he does things like suppress the vote before elections by telling people that no one's going to vote, as if it's not his job to make people go vote. He doesn't make it easy to vote. We had to sue him to move the registration date. We still have a really backwards registration date. The things that we bemoan Texas getting rid of, we can only dream of. Does anybody know a place that you can vote 24 hours a day in Massachusetts? You can just drive up. Does anybody have a drive-up voting anywhere in Massachusetts? I don't believe we have that anywhere. Let alone we just recently got drop boxes. We just recently got early voting in any real way. So, we are back.
Still don't have same-day registration.
We still don't have same-day registration, and we still don't have vote by mail. We have apply for an absentee ballot process, which is not vote by mail. And I want to make that clear because we should have vote by mail, like Oregon, like Colorado. And the result is that people of color continue to lag on voting. In 2020, Massachusetts was 50th, 50, the last in the country on voter turnout. The last. We are one of the worst states.
You said voter turnout, Black voter turnout.
Turnout. We are the lowest in the country, and we're one of the lowest in the country for Black registration. At 36% of Black folks turned out, which is just a little bit over, twice as like a little bit over half of, twice as many people of white people voting. So like half of the same rate. I mean, it's just atrocious. As a vote share, people of color made up roughly 13% of the electorate in 2020. And as a state, people of color make up 26% of the state. So that is a large voice that's going unheard through this process and needs encouragement to be a part of the process. Not to mention just sort of like the high rates of the census, right? where are people, where the lines were drawn, those all reflected privilege and all of those places. And to be clear for why it matters, Massachusetts loses a congressional seat were it not for people of color. And specifically, immigrants from South America, from the Caribbean, right? Like without people of color, this state loses a congressional seat. It loses say in Congress. So while we are making up the growth in this state, we are not making up the people who are accessing the ballot. And that's probably, although we can't say for sure, because I try to always say what we can make assumptions, but we don't know. We haven't done an analysis post-election on who voted for what. But probably reflects in sort of some of these ballot initiatives not doing as well as they could. Certainly reflects in the primary system, where you see sort of a more privileged voter showing up to that election. And so I think that again we need to remind ourselves that there's still work to be done around these things. And when thinking about how we think about Massachusetts, right? Because I do think of us as a very progressive state. We are a state which can imagine and do big things that lead the country. The reason that is because there's a lot of electorate who agrees with us, but we need to make sure that they're coming to the polls. We need to make it easier to vote, and we need to do everything possible to make sure that we're talking to folks, and not, again, just during election season. We need to be having conversations with people all the time, and we need to be running ads. We need to be educating people. Like that needs to be an ongoing process where people are. TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, where people are getting their information.
Absolutely. So one last topic is just about the last two ballot measures. The questions 5 and 6, or 6 and 5, or 6 and 7, or who knows what they were, because they were different in different places. But so that was Medicare for all, and basically transparency, whether we can know how state reps vote in committees. We've got some numbers. It seems like the transparency one did better than the Medicare for all one, but basically I think in every single district that either of them ran in, they passed. So everything above 50%.
Yeah, let's talk about transparency first, because that's my favorite, and it's something that we talk a lot about. And legislators continue to try to tell us that it's really not a big deal and people don't understand it or care about it. So it passed on average, 85% across towns in Massachusetts. And you're talking, you're talking Western Mass, South Coast, Hingham, 86%. Westboro, 86%. Cambridge, 94%. Right? You're talking Daniel Gregoire's did Middleborough. You're talking Pittsfield, 86%. Chicopee, 75%, which is one of the lower ones, right? Chicopee, still 75%. You're talking all across Boston. It's averaging 90, it's averaging about 85% across Boston, no matter what district you're in. And in Somerville, 91%, in Donato's district, 84%, right? Like it's just not any place. It's not super popular to, these are dictator numbers. These are, right? Like you would, if you saw this election, you'd be like, well, what was going on? Like these are numbers that should be alarming to our legislature that continues down this path of being the least transparent legislature in the country.
And almost every single one of those districts, the legislator is voting against transparency, because almost all of them vote against transparency.
That's right.
The Democrats. There you go. Whew, well, there you go.
And then for this, and then just for single payer, for single payer. So I think, again, this is another issue that people think of, and they think, oh yeah, but like, is single payer even popular? Like where, there's just, again, a lot of just misinformation about it. And so, every single place that single payer was on the ballot, again, it won. And it didn't win in just, sort of Boston, which it did win overwhelmingly by 80%. It won in Pittsfield by 75%. It won in Chicopee by 56%. It won in Chicopee by 58%. In Hingham, 56%. In Mariano's district, 67%. So it's not close anywhere. Like to say above 50% really doesn't do justice. It's wildly popular. And in places where question 1 went down, where question 4 lost, single payer won. Single payer.
One thing quickly on that, you can also see like the fact that question 2 did as well as it did, and they were clearly running on a message against kind of dental insurance company executives. So people don't like insurance companies. It's something that's always fascinating to me whenever we enter a healthcare discussion, and there's seemingly like this belief amongst legislators that people love insurance companies.
That's so weird. I never
And
get
like
that.
the way that we have to like dance around the kind of insurance companies, like nobody likes them. Nobody. If they tell you that if somebody tells you that they like an insurance company, they probably make a lot of money working at one. Other than that, people tend not to have positive experiences with them. And it's something that like that should enable you to have a greater political realm of possibility, because people may not love change in some spaces, but the thing that they probably hate more than they hate change is their insurance company.
Exactly. I totally agree. Well, if only we could have that be all over the ballot and pass them. And by the way, folks, it's worth noting that, there's like over 20 places that voted for each of these out of 160 districts. But these groups have been running these ballot measures, especially the Medicare for All one, cycle after cycle after cycle after cycle after cycle after cycle. And it always pretty much passes in every district, and sometimes overwhelmingly. So there are many more than just the ones that passed this time that have passed it in the past. And yet we still don't have it. That is a topic for another day. Thanks everybody. This has been super fun. Glad to, kind of celebrate our wins with these, almost all the ballot questions that got passed. Thank goodness for these 2 that have been going for like 16, 18, 20 years that they actually did in fact pass. Woohoo! Yay! And thanks everybody for listening. We will see you all next week.